Is radical change the key to America's survival? This is the burning question at the heart of today's episode of We the Patriots Podcast. I'm Sal Assante. Joining us today is Dr. John Marshall, an esteemed educator with a doctorate from Notre Dame and profound insights into American governance thanks to his undergraduate studies at Harvard University. His background, as well as our past conversations, enriches our exploration of Herb K's daring vision for overhauling the justice system in the 1964 plan, as well as Jack Decker's ambitious constitutional reform proposal highlighted in the state's First Amendment. Are these the changes we need to thrive in an ever-evolving world, or are they just steps towards an unrecognizable America? Tune in as we dissect these radical proposals with Dr. Marshall, whose expertise illuminates their implications for the future of the United States and the world. The journey into the depths of possibility starts now.
I just want to talk about this thing that's in my brain. It keeps me from wanting to go on, but I want some gain. Maybe a little fame.
So, John, it is awesome to have you back. We are
Great to be here.
now we are on number 3. That's got to be, I think that's got to be the most of any guest, or at least tied for it. Maybe Danny. Either way, Dr. John Marshall, you are at least one of my favorites, and honestly, one of my more liked people outside of podcasting in general. That being said, I do, and I'm sure a lot of my guests would respect your opinion over a lot of people's, especially in regards to just what's going on and possibly what could be going on, knowing, you have a history of attending Harvard and other prestigious places of study. Have you been seeing anything that is out of our airwaves? Like, we are seeing all sorts of stuff about Israel, Palestine, stuff about the Republicans bantering in between each other. Of course, you have the impeachment with Biden. What's coming across your feeds every now and then nowadays?
I don't know that I have anything unique in my feed, other than maybe some unique perspectives. One thing about going to a place like Harvard is you get people from all over the country, all over the world, with rather divergent views sometimes. So I'll see friends who are, very much, pro-Israel about everything, and then other ones who are, kind of, I don't know that you can be necessarily pro-Hamas, but I'll say, like, at least more concerned about the Palestinian cause. I think that the controversy that's kind of sparked up this last week had to do with the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and I forget what the third university was, but there were 3.
Harvard, it was UPenn, and it was MIT.
MIT, right? Exactly. But the UPenn president has now resigned. There was a lot of calls for the
Harvard president, I believe, and I believe that she stood strong.
Yeah, and the corporation actually had an emergency meeting to discuss it. Harvard Corporation, basically, kind of the president and fellows of Harvard College are kind of part of this Harvard Corporation, and they had a meeting and they affirmed their support for her. And listening to her testimony, I'm listening to it, and it was very Harvard-ish in that it was trying to say something without saying something, and
right.
Unfortunately, and it was, she probably was very good at it, saying something without saying something, but this is one of those cases where you have to kind of draw the line somewhere. And I think that you can say we believe in free speech, we respect the right of people to say things that even if we find them objectionable, because that was the heart of what was, the true free speech liberalism back at one time. But at the same time, you can also condemn genocide. You can say that what somebody's doing is wrong. If you want to go out there and make an idiot of yourself and yell objectionable and awful things, yes, it is your right to do so. It is, we have First Amendment protections, we have all this, but it doesn't make it right. And I think that in all of the very calculated and clipped, kind of very cautious speech that President Gay used in that congressional hearing was all trying to avoid saying something that might offend somebody, because I think we're we've gotten to a point where we're always afraid to offend somebody, and to simply come out and say that yes, genocide is wrong should not be a thing that requires a whole bunch of public relations massaging to get to the right language. And I think that sometimes when you're in that ivory tower, in that world of that sort of political political educational like ivory tower, it's hard to just come out and say the honest truth sometimes. And I think that was probably what really did in
Sure.
the UPenn president and all the others who were on that hearing there, is that they're so afraid of saying something that's going to offend somebody, that by not coming out and saying what needs to be said, they really missed an opportunity. And I think, and I would be, I'm upset for the fact that if you're a student on that campus, I don't think that you really feel that your free speech was all that protected by what she said, nor do I think that you feel that if you're a Jewish student or a Palestinian student or whatever, I don't think that you really got the sense that she had your back no matter what, because
Mm.
it was like, I'm more concerned with not offending somebody to protect my own position than I am with coming out and saying what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. But
It seemed like a pretty clear opportunity for them to make a stand. Now, I am curious on your take on this. So, from my judgment, I didn't just watch the clip. I tried to watch their whole testimony and their line of questioning. Number one, I wasn't too happy with the line of questioning because obviously I forget the congresswoman's name, but
oh,
the lady that was Stefanik. So she was going in pretty hard and she wouldn't change the line of questioning. And I thought she had an opportunity to possibly change the group that was being condemned and see if it sparked another answer from them.
mhm.
And then also I was a little taken aback that all three of the presidents seem to have very similar answers. Not necessarily the same, but very similar. And it seemed like it may have been workshopped, beforehand, maybe together. And I was curious on your takes on both of those. Hey everyone, it's Sal with a quick favor to ask. If you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into American future, please take a moment, leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Your reviews are the fuel that keeps our discussions vibrant and our community growing. It's simple but incredibly impactful. Just a few taps from you can help spread these conversations far and wide. Thank you for supporting We The Patriots Podcast. Every review counts, and yours could be the one that brings a new patriot into our fold. Let's get back to the show.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there were talking points going into it, and you see this if you watch some of the clips of other hearings, like if you watch the some of the committees that are as they interview witnesses, there's been this movement on both sides of the aisle. I think as the party in the minority in the Senate, I think you've seen certain Republicans do this quite a bit in the Senate. Um, it's kind of a tactic usually reserved for the party that's not in power, so it kind of maybe flip-flop in the House. But it's to try to make witnesses answer yes or no questions. In the courtroom, that's a leading question, and you're not really supposed to do that. But in Congress, anything goes. So it's like, would you tell me right here on the record, yes or no, and then give a rather complex question that sometimes really does require a nuanced answer. And I think that that's a little bit what she was doing. And Stefanik basically was like, will you say, this was right or wrong, yes or no? And like, I think that the president of the university could have handled it much better. I think it was handled rather poorly. But I think that when you're forcing somebody or pressing somebody over and over and over again to give me a yes or no answer, when the question is not really a yes or no question, it just becomes unnecessarily combative. And the one thing I will
That's what
say
I noticed. Yeah.
is that by having friends, and even if it's through a medium like hated Facebook. But even if it's through something like that, I may not agree with some of the perspectives that I see my friends post, but at least it gives me a chance to kind of understand where you're coming from.
Yeah,
And
the thought process. Right, right.
it's almost like we've outlawed cognitive dissonance in this country because we've become so polarized that we can't possibly hold two thoughts in our head at the same time.
Right.
And I think this is one of those cases where, you can say legitimately, we believe in free speech. We believe in people's right to say whatever it is they want, you know, short of, yelling fire in a crowded theater and all that kind of stuff. But like,
Mm.
say your thing. We don't have to agree. We don't have to like it. We don't have to endorse it, whatever, but it's your right to say it. On the other hand, we can also condemn an act of violence or an act of terror or whatever we think is truly horrible. And we can say that too. We can say, what you're saying is really dumb and we oppose what you're saying. We're not going to prevent you from saying it. And
Right.
you see this on the other side of where you have universities shutting down conservative speakers, the Ben Shapiro's, the Charlie Kirks, where the universities have canceled some of their appearances and stuff like that because they thought it might cause strife or
Yeah.
something like that. And it's like, let them say it. You don't have to agree with them, but if you can't even hear what the other side has to say, then how are you ever going to understand it? How are you ever going to bring resolution to this? Like, nobody ever negotiated a peace settlement or anything like that by just pounding and pounding one idea over and over again. The only way you can ever get your way that is historically is militarily, where you just pound somebody into submission. And even then, that doesn't work really well because you see what happened after World War One. They pounded Germany into submission. Germany agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, and
Right.
guess
Right.
what? It didn't work out real well. So, understanding where folks are coming from, again, even if you don't agree with them, is important. And I think that could have been said much better by those presidents. But I think that they were going off of talking points, and I think so much of this political theater, the congressional testimonies and stuff like that, it's all prepared. And you get these people who are up there for federal judgeships and stuff like that, and they get asked a question, and they're flipping through their papers to read their pre-written answer.
Response. Yep.
It's like, what are we doing here? We're just wasting everybody's time because we know what they're going to say. We know what their answer is going to be. And then to say over and over and over again, when they get pressed about a particular, oh, you made this decision in whatever year, and, or you wrote this paper, and, when you were in the university, and, do you stand by these comments now? And then they always have the same canned response: was that paper was in my capacity as a student writing for an editorial journal at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and is not reflective of my opinions, and that will not be how I judge, and I will judge based on press. I mean, go shoot me now. Like, who wants to hear this over and over and over again? And then the next senator comes up with the next paper that this person read, and it's just it's not productive. And I think that we've kind of gotten to the point where nobody wants to give a real answer, because when they do give a real answer, then it gets,
That's when they get hung.
well, yeah, and it becomes like, clipped into 5-second sound bites and thrown all over the internet, and next thing you know, they're a pariah, and can never get another job again. So it's forcing people into this like completely artificial way of communicating with each other, rather than simply asking questions and getting answers. It's like, I just have to
Right.
I have to be talking for the posterity of the soundbite. And I think that's the kind of the trap that these presidents fell into, is that they were so concerned about not saying something that could then be held against them in some way, shape, or form, that they really
Right.
missed the point of what needed to be said, which was, yes, we believe in free speech, but yes, we also object to genocide. Anybody who calls for genocide is not somebody we really want on our campus. Like, we might not stop them from speaking, but they're a problem, and that just didn't get.
Right. So I had a question actually based on kind of something that you were hitting on, and that was in the regards to a state having to basically use its power, use its force in order to push on either a way of thinking or to force on a law that's being pushed or a war. Right. So had you gotten to read into any of Herb K's 1964 plan?
Yeah, actually, I watched the entire first episode with him, and I read
Oh, interesting. Okay.
read the abstract, and I got about well, I'll say halfway through the second, the bonus
So
episode.
as you heard him articulating, and I wonder if you caught some of the line of speech that kind of, triggers off fire bells and warning signs in my head was he said the timing needs to be right in order for this to work. And it's only going to work when shit hits the fan. Okay, and that's him talking about his plan. And what that sounds like to me, and as you read into his plan a little bit deeper, he's not really for a democratic way of voting or of life. And it's very much I don't want to say military dictatorship, but it's definitely heading towards that way. And if you follow his line of thinking, it's very much along the lines of someone who's been in the military before. What was your outlook of the plan? And to me, I did see some benefits in it, and I'm curious what you saw.
I think what he was talking about was the need for disruptive change, and there's kind of the cynical saying in politics, which is never let a crisis go to waste.
Go to waste,
Uh,
yeah.
but there's also and this is true in business, it's true in life. Sometimes you need something radical to happen to make a change. It's
Sure.
very, very hard if you're just kind of going along and, you know, year after year, and things are kind of going, more or less okay, even if they're slipping a little bit,
Right.
to say, you know what, full stop, we need radical change. Let's throw out everything we're doing and start over. When you have some type of a very disruptive thing, whether it's a natural disaster, a giant stock market correction like we had in 1929, companies that have some sort of major crisis or catastrophe, you look at or even in our personal lives, he talked a lot about addiction and things like that in his videos.
Yes.
People who are, I'll just keep it simple without going into the drug use and stuff like that. Let's say you're a drinker, and you're kind of, you start by drinking casually, and then you start drinking a little more and whatever, but you don't necessarily feel that you're quote unquote an alcoholic or whatever.
Right.
But you're kind of going down this slope where maybe you're drinking more and more. It's not necessarily, something that you're gonna just all of a sudden one day say, you know what, I'm drinking too much. Maybe some people might, but it's
As a percentage, it's not going to be most.
that wake up call. If something, if you get a DUI, if that drinking then leads to some, major fight in your family or whatever, where all of a sudden there's like a, disruptive event that says, dude, you need to change. I get pulled over for driving drunk or whatever, that might all of a sudden say, whoa, wake up, slap you in the face and say, I need to make a change in my life. Without that disruptive element, it's hard to do. And so I think in terms
Right.
of the economics that he's talking about, we push the Congress keeps doing these continuing resolutions. They keep pushing spending down and down and down. And as long as people are willing to lend the government money, there's not necessarily going to be that real impetus to change anything about how we're doing it. I think he's right that if there were to be he's talking about a major correction within the next year, and hey, anything's possible.
Mhm.
I don't know that it'll be that soon, but if there were, yeah, maybe that would be, if there was something on the scale of 1929 again, maybe that would be the wake up call that would say, all right, maybe we need to look at how we're doing Social Security. Maybe we need to look at how we're doing the welfare
Right.
state, how we're doing spending, entitlements, and on down the line. Um, yeah, those disruptive things definitely do produce more results. Sometimes for the good, sometimes not for the good. Um,
Right.
you know, and it's, we're not talking about even just policy. This is biology. There's in evolutionary biology, there's a thing called punctuated equilibrium.
Okay.
You have a species. There's a perfect example of some squirrels in Arizona. It's um, there's these squirrels running around, whatever. Um, over time, the Grand Canyon widens. The squirrels can no longer cross from one side to the other, and they become two separate species: the kaibab squirrels and the whatever they are, the other squirrels. They're no longer the same species because they have been separated. Something happened,
Put space in between.
punctuated equilibrium. They were intermingling up until a time. Geographic or geologic changes occurred. They no longer were the same population. They eventually became speciated and became separate species. That will create the change that would have taken much longer over, had that punctuated equilibrium
Had that event not occurred.
occurred. So I think it's certainly something that could happen in in any country at any time. You could have some major disaster. I mean, I think in our lives, 9/11 was one of those kinds of events. I mean, it did not happen in terms of economy necessarily, but it certainly was a major event in terms of changing the way that the people and the government related to each other.
Right. Our interaction in between ourselves. Yeah.
I think it also culturally, I think we launched in the last 20 years, 22 years has been, there's been so much more focus on safety and security that
Mhm.
than I can ever remember in the years pre 9/11. And it's not just airports and TSA and taking your shoes off. I mean, it's in schools, it's in workplaces, it's
Tech.
even the way
Stuff we
people
don't see.
even the way people parent their children. I think there's been so
Right.
much more emphasis on safety and security, and I think that some of the helicopter parenting might have already been starting, but I think it kind of went on steroids in the last
Oh
couple
yeah.
decades.
Yeah, that makes sense.
People are kind of bubble wrapping their kids because it's that whole notion of, when something like that happens, it changes people's psyche. It's like, these people, 2,800 people, whatever it was, you know, got up for work that morning, went to work and didn't come home. And so then, post that event, you had this like, hug your children. You never know when it's going to be your last day of seeing them. And
Right.
usually that's the kind of stuff reserved for people who are, you know, line of duty folks like law enforcement and military. And here you have people who were accountants going to work who had that experience, and I think it introduced a level of trauma on a national scale, maybe even a global scale, that really hadn't been there before. And so when you see those kinds of events, like the changes may be subtle in the moment, but if you look back and say, all right, well, first there was this, and then first you had TSA, then you had Patriot Act, then you had Homeland Security, then you had that, whatever. But if you look back 20 years now and you compare the world as it is today with what it was in 1999, it's a lot has changed.
Right.
So a lot of it centers around those kinds of you know government intervention with the idea of we will protect you, but not in the way that it had been before, which was kind of a distant military to prevent foreign attack and invasion, but a much more personal experience with safety and security. He's talking about that on an economic front. If we had a disruptive major economic catastrophe that forced the government's hand, that forced a default on the currency. Could it then lead to these kinds of disruptive changes that would, you know, make something happen? And it's possible. It would require
Right.
leadership and some consensus, and I don't know that we have either of those at the moment.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so, and I kind of, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have it in the current administration. We didn't have it in the previous administration. It seems likely we were going to have it in the next administration. So there are very few events that, quote unquote, bring everyone together behind a certain idea. You could say that 9/11 was one of those ideas, the events that brought everyone together, under the sort of banner of Americanism and patriotism. Unfortunately, I think it got twisted in a bit of a way that was steered by a reaction rather than thoughtful discourse. And now I don't even know that we have thoughtful discourse. So
Yeah, but that's always, I mean, that's always the fear. And one last question that I had in regards to the 1964 plan in particular was the main contention was that legalizing basically all drugs and seeing what profits you'd see from that, and not only that, the outflow of people from incarceration would be so high that the money saved and be able to reinvest and not having to invest in this drug war anymore. I guess two questions. One, do you think that it would have the effect economically that he proposes? And two, do you think it's actually not just morally, but really in general, the right thing to do?
I think that, I listened to Herb, and he made a lot of really good and valid and interesting points. And I mean, I don't
Couldn't agree
disagree
more.
with a lot of what he said. I mean, his talk about the nuclear family, I think, was very spot on, and the need for that. I think he talked about how the Great Society and the welfare state had caused a lot of the problems that we're experiencing now. Absolutely spot on. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I've had the opportunity to work in some cities that, if it weren't for the welfare state existing as it does, those cities just simply wouldn't exist. They were company towns or industry towns where the industry left, and these cities have no reason to exist anymore. And in in an environment where they were not being propped up by government transfers, the people would have gone somewhere else. They would have gotten, moved in search of jobs, moved in search of better opportunities, moved to family, done something. They certainly wouldn't have stayed in a place that had no jobs, no future, no hope, no reason to exist. And yet, because of government transfers, they were able to subsist, and they have stayed. And now you have whole cities with not nearly enough jobs, no reason to, to support the populations that they do. And as a result, these are cities that are incredibly dangerous and violent, where you have rampant drug use and alcoholism and all these other problems. So I think that the idea that the welfare state created many of these things, and again, it was, as he points out, it was a well-intentioned proposal, but maybe not the most wise decision. I think that the biggest problem, or the biggest issue in terms of the way he lays things out, is that I think there has to be a sequence to it. I don't think you can wave a magic wand, even if you had the power to, and do all of these things tomorrow and have it work the way he envisions it. I don't disagree with many of the things that he's talking about, but I think it would have to be a step-by-step process. I don't think that you just legalize all drugs and then, that'll just fix all the crime situations, and we can empty out the prisons and let everybody go, and expunge all of the drug offenses, and that everybody just goes back to living happily ever after. It's a lot more complicated than that. And it really, it starts with that nuclear family concept. I mean, you want to go back to the 92 election, which is when Clinton won his first term, defeated George H.W. Bush, and Dan Quayle, who was the vice president, was notoriously panned for talking about family values at no end. And I mean, he got a few things a little convoluted, but essentially he was right. I mean, he was talking about the decline of the family structure and the decline of morality. And I think that the kinds of changes that Herb was proposing would work in a society where you had this instilled morality.
Okay, I see what you're
don't
saying. Yeah.
like. I don't think that you take anybody who was willing to go out there and rob and steal and murder and do all these horrible things, whether it was in the name of drugs or not. If they were willing to commit violent enough acts that they were sent to state or federal prison, there's something broken in that essential human morality there. And that is not something where I think we can just say, oops, our bad, we're just going to legalize everything and wipe all of your offenses clean. I mean, there's forgiveness, and then there's also like the common sense of like, we do not necessarily want to release every dangerous felon in the country out onto the street at the same time, because if we think we got anarchy now, that would be even worse. And you see in places like New York, where they essentially aren't prosecuting anybody for anything, you just get this revolving door. People keep same offenses over and over again. The prosecutors aren't doing anything about it, and you have a city that's really in decline. It's a shame, because it's one of the great cities of the world, and it's very much in decline compared to where it was 15, 20 years ago.
Even 10
and
years
actually
ago.
there's a great quote by John Adams. I'm gonna try not to butcher it, but he talks about our Constitution was written only for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly unsuited to the government of any other, or something pretty close to that. He throws the religious part in there, but the essential morality of living in a free country, it requires people who are basically going to follow the laws. We're a huge country. There was always a fear that, or a belief that, a republic could not be a large country covering a great expanse, and certainly not a democracy. As Herb points out, there's 340 million people. We can't vote on every single issue. So
which
therefore,
is completely fair. Yeah.
We have representatives. The notion of a republic, and what we have as a federal republic, is that you've got this not only representation, but you have a group of people who are entrusted with the special care and administration of the government. When he talks about his kind of plan for selecting, I'll say, the House and the Senate, I'm with him 100% that we have money that's ruining politics. That the idea that Congress people are fundraising 80% of their days, and that it takes millions of dollars to run a campaign for a job that pays $200,000 a year doesn't make any sense to anybody. And how on earth does somebody go to Congress and become richer in the process when they're taking a job that pays less than they were making before? There's a lot of dirty money and a lot of that sketchiness out there that I would love to get rid of. I don't know that picking people at random ping pong balls or out of the phone book or whatever is the answer. I think what we've had this series of democratizing events in our history. I mean, the creation of the republic itself was a democratizing event in that it gave the vote to a larger swath of people that had it before. There was another major effort towards democratization under Andrew Jackson. Jackson was like the man of the people, and so the 1820s, he lost in the election of 1824. An election that he kind of thought was stolen from him, but that didn't really stop his supporters from pushing on the democratization issues. And by 1828, more people were allowed to vote. They got rid of a lot of the property owning requirements. They got rid of some of the poll taxes, things like that were limiting people from voting. And so more people voted. But still, it was restricted. It was still men. It was still, maybe not landowners at that point, but it was a certain subset of the population. And there was another wave of democratization in the progressive era, where you had women's suffrage. You had, of course, in the years following the Civil War, you had the initial passage, 1868, where you had African Americans getting the right to vote legally. And then, subsequently for the next 100 years, you had efforts to try to make that stick all the way up to the Civil Rights Act 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. So you had 100 years of democratizing influences there. And then there were more subtle changes as well. You had, at one point there was the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. That went to a direct election to the Senate. You had the primary process. You go back into the 1800s, there were not the kinds of primaries that we have now. Generally, you'd have a convention, and somebody would nominate one candidate, somebody else would nominate another candidate. There'd be just debates and discussions, and sometimes you'd have people that kind of came out of the woodwork. Abraham Lincoln went to the convention not necessarily expecting to get the nomination. I mean, he had a plan in the back of his mind, but he was not the front runner by any means. But he came out as the nominee, and that happened on a number of occasions. The one thing about it is that it forced the parties wanted to put their best foot forward. They're thinking, who is our most electable person, or most electable candidate? It wasn't about appealing to
the voter
masses. It was, we need to choose for the good of our party who's our best choice. And so what it did is it created, and I'm not saying there wasn't corruption and stuff like that, because there was certainly corruption, there was backroom dealing and all that, and some of it had very much a cloud of shadowy deal making at times. But the parties were certainly incentivized to put forward a candidate who had a good chance of winning an election. And the result was that for a good deal of time, you had relatively centrist candidates on both sides. You look at the politics of, say, the 1880s, for example, immediate post-Civil War years, you had a string of Republican presidents, kind of flowing off of the Lincoln to, well, Johnson was a Union candidate along with Lincoln, but then he was quickly succeeded by Grant. And then you had a bunch of Civil War leading figures, general kind of types, who all kind of was on that Lincoln Republican train for a number of years. And it wasn't until the mid 1880s that you start seeing some back and forth, one Republican administration, Democrat administration, back and forth. And when you saw that, the one thing that's most remarkable about that period is that the politics of the various presidents are nearly indistinguishable. I mean, you look from, Garfield to Arthur to Hayes to um, Cleveland to Harrison back to Cleveland. McKinley, there's not a great deal of difference in many of the perspectives, and even some of the candidates that didn't win. You look at the Hayes Tilden election. Their politics are, there's very, very little difference in there. And by running to the center, you kind of had candidates who were not necessarily going to, be particularly radical or do anything out of the ordinary. Did it produce great presidents? Occasionally, not always. Did it produce
less bad ones though?
I think you would, let's just put it this way. If the Republican Party and the Democratic Party today could go out there and in some type of party, party leaders caucus where all let's say the governors from each party got to get together and say, like, who's our best candidate? And all the Republicans could do that and all the Democrats could do that. Does anybody think that the two people that they would come up with would be Trump and Biden? That these are the best people to possibly lead our country, to be the ambassador for our party? I don't think that they'd be picking 80-year-olds, one who is a loose cannon at best, and the other one who is,
a flimsy cannon.
Sadly, apparently rather senile and not really in.
Yeah. But there's fears for Trump to go senile too in his term, which is scary.
I mean, and he's, and the fact that he's not, he's got clearly a strong fan base, which is is always the fear of an overly democratized political system, is that it becomes all about the personality of the candidate. And the presidency has increased in power so much through the expansion of executive authority that it has allowed it to become all about the personality of the president. Even you looking back at presidents like Roosevelt and Truman and Ike, who were certainly big personalities in and of themselves, but there was not you didn't have that vitriol of opposition. Like, there were people who didn't vote for Ike, but I don't think that there were a whole lot of people that were out there absolutely like losing their minds that Ike got elected president, or or Truman or whatever. Like, there was, whereas now, you have, Trump gets elected and like the whole, far left melts down in 2016, and then Biden gets elected and the right kind of melts down in 2020. And it's and the idea that we have to impeach every president that we don't like. And granted, there's a lot of corruption and stuff like that, but it just feels like we've lost any sort of sense of what do the actual people of the country want from their leaders, because I don't think this is it.
I couldn't agree more. And that really makes me think of how many people I've heard say that, are these two people really the best representatives for our country? And yet it's still happening. And it makes me really think of how much are these polls being manipulated? How much of this stuff is really American opinion? Or is it really back channel where we don't really have as much of a say as we think? And
I think that
I get more and more fearful of that every day, especially in our age, with all the technology, all of the AI that's getting introduced.
I think the technology is a huge part of it. I think that the social media is a huge part of it. The every time there's a major change in media and the way people consume information, you have these kinds of things. There was, early in our history, you had the penny press, which was, was just that. It was newspapers for a penny, and it was like the first really democratized, if you will, newspapers. And the penny press tended to be, um, kind of, we're not talking about like the highest journalistic ethics here. We're talking about stuff that was churned out quickly and on a cheap budget, and often done with a certain political spin. And a lot of cities had papers that were explicitly partisan. Now we have media outlets that maybe claim to be nonpartisan, but everybody kind of knows what their bent is.
Mm.
But there was a time when you'd have newspapers that were, obviously one, political affiliation or the other. It'd be you know, the Pittsburgh Republican and the Pittsburgh Democrat or whatever. Like, in
Right.
fact, and there's a handful of some of those papers have actually still survived.
Mm.
I think
Interesting.
upstate New York. There's a paper that's called the shoot, it's some kind of the Democrat or the Times Democrat or whatever. And you had a lot of mergers that eventually got these.
I'm sure bought up,
These
or
papers.
the best one, or the most the highest selling one, I'm sure tried to eke it out for longer. Yeah,
Yep.
that's interesting. I mean, now, like you said, you could see it. It's pretty blatant in, if not in their stories and what they're targeting, then in the writing. You don't usually have to go far.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you have, and what it creates is kind of what I started with. I was talking about the Middle East stuff, is that
Mhm.
you kind of get these vacuums that if you only, if you're a Republican and you want to consume, right wing stuff, and all of your friends are kind of a like mind, you're going to get that fed back to you, because the algorithms are going to say that you want to see content from, you know, Hannity, and the content from The Blaze, and content from, yeah, you know, whatever. And if you're left wing, and then it's going to feed you Rachel Maddow, and it's going to,
Right.
whatever, and that's all you're seeing. You go on TV, if your preset is for Fox News, that's what you're going to get. If your preset's for MSNBC, that's what you're going to get. There's no real sense of that balance there, and it allows for this kind of echo chamber effect to occur, where you have people living in the same country, maybe even working in the same office, who have vastly different understandings of what's actually even going on in the world, just
Mhm.
because of
Just
where
based on what they're
they can,
listening, reading,
yeah, they
watching.
can, what they consume, what their information is. And those are the people who are actually interested in politics. Like, if I wanted
Right.
to, if I didn't click on any political stuff, and all I clicked on was, videos about baseball, that's probably all it would give me, is videos about baseball, and I'd just be watching baseball all the time, and
Mhm.
oblivious to anything going on in the world. So
Right.
it's kind of a a messy situation. I don't know how to work our way out of it, in the sense
Mm.
that, um, I don't fault the tech companies, or the social media platforms, for doing what they're doing.
Right.
They're trying to get click. They're trying to get people to use them, um, and people want to see what they want to see. Like, you could put, you could suggest Hillary Clinton speeches to me. I'm not going to click on it, because I don't want to see Hillary Clinton. I don't want to listen to her. I don't want to see her. I don't want. If I never hear her again, I'd be thrilled. Um, so it's not about like feeding and pushing information from the the opposite side necessarily, but
Mm.
I think that the echo chamber effect of some of the algorithms is not really healthy either, and I think it pushes people to be more and more extreme.
I think it's important for us, just as people living in this time, to pay attention to that and be cognizant of that. Like, we all do have inherent biases, whether it's in politics or sports or in your area of study. Even like something like biology can bring up, heated debates amongst
Mhm.
people. It's important to realize your own biases and your own echo chambers, especially nowadays, that we are all in them, whether we know it or not.
Mhm.
Um, and before we ended up closing this out, I did want to ask you a little bit about State's First Plan. I was wondering if you got to read it. It was very short and sweet. The podcast between me and Jack wasn't. He had quite a bit to say, and I was curious if you thought the plan actually detailed, especially really it's called the State's First Plan. Really, the only first point focused mainly on the states, and the rest of it was more um, focused about its outward reaching effects, it seemed. How did you feel about that first point in the amendment, and did it go far enough to give states what they've lost over the past, I'd say about century and a half, roughly, is the time frame he thinks that states have lost their power, really?
There's absolutely no doubt that states have less power than they do now. I think we would be well served, and actually Herb mentioned this too in terms of the entitlements. He suggested pushing that down to the states, which I think would also be wise, and
Mhm.
allow states to craft their own plans, because that would also, you know, force a little bit more of a balanced budget that the federal government can't seem to manage. On the other hand,
Right.
the tricky part about that is that people move from state to state, and so how do you make things portable from one state to another? But I do like the idea of having um, a sort of revival of what the notion of a federal republic is. I mean, federalism, the concept of federalism, is that you have, you know, a a, a national level government, and then you have state level governments, and those states join together into a union to make a republic. But the states have a lot of rights within that republic.
Right.
And so in that notion of federalism, like, the states really become the power players. And what has happened over time is that has been eroded little by little. And it's been a product of two things. Number one, there's been some deliberate attempts to try to uh, shift power to the federal government, because the more power the federal government has, the more money, more resources, more everything, and that makes the people in Washington more powerful. In fact, early in our country's history, it was actually not uncommon for people who were elected to be members of the U.S. Congress to leave Congress to go run for state legislature back home, because the state legislature was a better gig. They had more power,
Interesting.
paid better, was better respected, because people were, it didn't have people moving from Virginia to New York on a regular basis. Like, if you were
Mhm.
in Virginia, you were taking care of Virginia, and so being part of the Virginia legislature was, you know, House of Delegates, I believe they call it, or whatever it was, mattered a lot more to the average people in that state. So if
Right.
you were from Maryland or Virginia, wherever, like, that's what mattered. And over time, the state legislatures have gotten less and less power, and a lot of it has to do with money. So pushing more back down to the states, I'm totally on board with. In terms of uh, the actual plan,
Mm.
it's I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah, I was skeptical for a couple of reasons. I'll bring up mine, and I really want to hear what you had to say. One, I thought the scope got very broad very quick,
Mhm.
trying to solve a lot of different problems with something that's pretty simple. I think it's a pretty simple amendment. You want the states to have more power, and you're trying to release some of the actions that have been taking place, like I said, over the past century and a half and possibly longer. It broadened its scope really wide, and I also thought this is a minor thing, but basically what he was proposing was there's not going to be any more in-person debates and or in-person events in general.
Mhm.
All be telecommunicated, and I just don't like that. I don't like it. I don't mind telecommunicating something that is live in person, but I do have an issue with, we're going to log into our Zoom chat and we're going to deliberate business here. We're going to do work of Congress. I just feel like it allows for a lot of room for manipulation. I would love your take on it.
Yeah, no, I think there, like, I mean, look, there's things that could be done over Zoom. Like, if there was a I served on some boards. Like, we managed to function during COVID over Zoom. I know Congress managed to do some things over Zoom. Like, if there is a procedural hearing, or like you know a a vote on naming a post office in West Virginia, like, if you want to do that over Zoom, like, hey, fine. Like, no, like that. I think that is something that could be done, and maybe there's ways of
Sure.
streamlining what actually happens in Washington. But I think that going all virtual is not necessarily the answer. And then I think just like some of the changes that he proposed in terms of like how the House and the Senate are composed, that doesn't necessarily get
Yeah.
to the heart of it, which is that right now you've got, um, if the state legislatures are doing anything, it's that they're the ones drawing the districts, and the parties have kind of colluded together in many places to draw districts that are not necessarily competitive. And it's done both ways. In fact, many states have nonpartisan, or quote unquote nonpartisan commissions, where they have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans supposedly drawing these districts. And in those cases, what they do is they basically say, look, all right, here's the deal. Like, we don't want to spend a ton of money and have a whole bunch of fights every 2 years. So let's say there's 7 districts in our state. We're going to draw 3 safe Democrat districts. We're going to draw 3 safe Republican districts, and we'll have one that's really competitive. And that'll be the one competitive district every year. And once in a long while, maybe one party will pick off one of the other ones or not. But more or less, you're going to have a lot of uncompetitive districts. And that's what they'll do, is they'll draw uncompetitive districts. Now, then you get a part,
Makes sense.
a state where you have one party in control, and they try to get a little greedy, and they try to draw extra districts in their favor. We have that in New Jersey right now. I mean, there's, you look at New Jersey, and Murphy won re-election as governor. It was like 50, I'll say 53-46 or something like that. It was not a landslide. It was pretty
tight, yeah.
it
It
might
might have even
closer.
been 52. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
But
not by a lot. And it shouldn't have been. By all rights, it shouldn't have been.
no, I mean, if
That was with,
anybody
John
deserved,
C., I believe.
if anybody deserved to not be reelected, it was Murphy. But the point was, is that it's close to 50, 53, 47, 52, 48, whatever it was.
Mhm.
Half of the people in New Jersey almost voted against this guy. And yet, that when you look at how the districts in the House play out, you've got, I think, 2 Republican districts out of the entire state. And, whatever we have, or 14 districts or whatever it is now. And like, you look at how, we live in the 11th district, a district that historically had been basically Morris County.
Right.
But when the Democrats redrew it, all of a sudden it's Morris County, but we've got this tail that goes down and picks up East Orange and Montclair. And
Right.
what on earth do we have in common with the Oranges and Montclair? But it
Doesn't matter because it's drawn.
it was drawn that
upon by
way
the partisan line.
to put enough Democrat votes in. And then when you add in some towns that are 50-50-ish in Morris County, like the Parsippany's, and there's not enough votes in Kinnelon and Montville to overcome Montclair.
Right.
And so you've created a Democratic district in a Republican area. If you wanted to do like you don't even need to be. I think I heard wanted to draw like a grid for his lottery system, where it's like every district is the same size. Like,
yeah, he wanted to do it like postage stamp size, like original plots. Yeah.
yeah, that to me like doesn't really fly, in the sense that like a district in Sussex County or whatever is going to have dramatically fewer people, and therefore those people are going to have a much greater chance of serving in Congress than, the same size
comparison
district in New York City. But like for sports, the NJSIAA uses a system called Northing, and they have a two numerical, like it's basically a north-south and an east-west
correct
number, and they draw their state sections based on this Northing. It's mathematical. Like how much, if we did that with our districts and said, okay, New Jersey has a population of, I'm just going to use round numbers. It's a little different than this, but let's say 15 million people, and there's 15 districts. So we have, exactly
About
1 million per
district.
district. We're just going to sit there and use this Northing thing, and we're going to come up with, like, we'll start it, up in whatever
the northwest and go southeast.
Montague, I guess it is, like up in the north.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to go up there and we're going to say, all right, give me 1 million people, and then we're going to cut districts based on that. You'd have geographically mathematical districts of equal population that would make far more sense than, what it would probably do is it put Sussex together with parts of Morris and Warren. Totally logical.
Correct.
And yeah, maybe parts of Morris, like Northeast Morris, might get lumped in with, I don't know, West Milford or even parts of Bergen County or whatever, or maybe parts of Southern Morris might get lumped in with Hunterdon and Somerset or whatever. And guess what would happen if you did that? You'd basically end up with 2 to 3
races pretty much everywhere, you would think.
Well, you'd have more competitive races, and you'd also have, you'd probably have a safe Republican district in the north. That would be Sussex, Warren, Northern Morris. You'd have probably 2 slightly Republican-leaning districts you'd have like the Morris and Western Passaic,
sure,
and parts of Bergen. And you'd probably have the Western Morris, Hunterdon, Somerset. That even might be safe Republican, depending on exactly how it was drawn.
Yeah, right.
And then in the South, you'd probably have, Monmouth Ocean is usually a relatively safe Republican district. Depending on how those districts got drawn down there. The Camden and South, Cumberland and Gloucester might get lumped in with Camden. You might end up with a Republican district with Atlantic and Cape May, but you'd probably have more Democratic districts still, because you'd have, several districts kind of concentrated in the Newark general area, from Jersey City to Patterson to Newark to Elizabeth and the Oranges and all. And you'd have a couple down by Trenton and Camden. So you probably still have more Democratic districts, but you'd have competitive districts, and you'd have a congressional delegation that was probably much more closely mirrors the actual population. You'd probably have something
based off of math and not a human fudging with it for their own good or bad, depending on what they're thinking. You're dealing with straight statistics and math. It should statistically, if we have like you were saying, a 48 to 52, our district should resemble that voting pattern.
Right. And an off year, like we do our governors in an off year, which tends to be a little bit more conservative. So even if the true state breakdown is, let's say, 55-45 Democrat or whatever, that means that it should be something like 5 Democrats for every 4 Republicans, which is, would probably be much more of a close approximation to what the average, the total ideological bent of New Jersey is. There was a time when I think we only had 1 single Republican. It was like Chris Smith was like holding down the fort until until Jeff Van Drew flipped parties. So, crazy that you'd have an entire state with over 10, I forget the exact, I think it's like 13 or 14 congressional districts.
It's somewhere in between. Yeah.
And
I
one
want to say
single,
it's 14.
yeah,
or
and
13.
one single Republican for a while out of all those districts.
Yeah.
And you've got like the Sussex County, that crazy 5th district that's drawn all the way down over into Bergen to give Gottheimer his seat. Well, he would never win in Sussex County by himself, but
Right.
he pulls the Bergen County vote. Mikey Sherrill would never win in Morris County by itself, but she's got Montclair. And they're not, I don't think Gottheimer and Sherrill are bad people. In fact, I'd take either of them over our current senator, who's apparently working for Egypt. But
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
But
there's been a lot of calls for that guy to get out of there, man.
Oh my God.
Impressive.
It's going to actually be kind of amusing if he does try to run again to see how that plays out, because either it's going to be, I mean, if he gets the Democratic nomination, which I would hope that people on that side of the aisle would, pick somebody else, anybody else. But he's got a lot of money, he's got a war chest, and he's going to go out there and try to get re-election. And it'd be pretty funny if it came down to New Jersey being a competitive Senate election next fall. But I think I know you want to probably wrap up, because I think we're probably at, or maybe even over.
We're at around an hour. We could definitely wrap it up soon. I just wanted, whatever your closing thoughts were, surrounding the two elements. What I'm getting out of you is it seemed like Herb's plan definitely pointed out a lot of problems that you concur with, and then still we concur with some of the statements made in the state's first plan, but it was some of the solutions might not be pointing in the direction he thinks.
So the thing I'll say about the state's First Amendment, we have the amendment process in our Constitution,
and that's something I did want to ask a little bit about.
It's there for a reason. It's there to allow for the changes to occur when there is an overwhelming consensus to make a certain change. However, the people who drafted the Constitution, and for that matter, the people who led the American Revolution, were generally conservative in their approaches and their views about politics in general. It sounds a little crazy that they were conservative revolutionaries, but they were. They were attempting, when you talk about conservatism, and the notion is, what is it that you are trying to conserve? What are you trying to?
Where does that name even come from? Yep.
And these revolutionary era leaders were trying to preserve was the notion of individual rights that they believed were enshrined in the British Constitution, that they felt were being denied, and that their rights as British citizens were not being really preserved in the way that they should by the king's government. And so when they created their own government, they focused very heavily on the preservation of rights. The Constitution is not a set of rules of things you can't do. It is a set of guarantees of rights. It's a framework for government, and it is a set of guarantees of personal liberties. One of the things I think, just as an aside, so many times civics classes, and I may have gone down this tirade before, but it's one of my favorite tirades to go on. You go into a social studies class, beginning of the year, it's like, okay, let's develop a class constitution. And what do? Oh, well, you can't chew gum. You can't, do this. You have to raise your hand if you want to, talk or go to the bathroom. Whatever
stuff you can't do, and it's not stuff that you have the right to do.
It's always it's self-serving on the behalf of the teacher, because they can say, well, we agreed to our class constitution, but it's always a set of behaviors that the teacher wants to put forward, things that they, this is what your students should and should not do. And that's not what a constitution is in the mindset of any American, or at least it shouldn't be. And it wasn't what the Revolutionary era thought they were getting out of the British Constitution. When they felt that their rights were being violated, that's what led to the revolt. And so they built into their own constitution a mechanism to allow the people to change when there was sufficient reason and need for change. And we've amended the Constitution, even after the original Bill of Rights, the first 10, we've amended it, 9 times in total. So managed to get 19 more amendments afterwards. And most of the amendments are in many ways lagging indicators of what people felt was right in the country at the time. Obviously the Civil War, the series of amendments that followed that were almost an afterthought, because the war had clearly been fought over the issue of slavery, and so abolishing slavery and guaranteeing civil rights was kind of a logical next step. Women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, again, kind of a bit of a many states had already allowed women to vote and even hold public office long before that. So the society was already moving in that direction. It was kind of a clear direction of where we were going, and then we passed the amendment. So in fact, one of our more recent amendments to lower the voting age to 18, that followed a long period of time where people were asking this question of, like, if I can get drafted and go fight and die for my country, then why can't I vote for it? And there were, like, I would say that by the time that amendment was approved, there was a really strong consensus that this made a lot of sense, that there should be, if the age of majority to go to war is one thing, it should also be the age of majority to vote. Just makes sense. So the mechanism is there, but again, these people who wrote the Constitution were conservatives. They did not want the Constitution amended willy-nilly. They didn't want it to be something where one president would come in and all of a sudden pass a whole bunch of amendments and make the Constitution work for him, and then have another president come in and make the Constitution, work for her. And I have these back and forth things where the Constitution becomes just a battleground, tug of war rope. It was supposed to be something where, okay, you can have your little political games, but the Constitution doesn't really change until we're all basically in agreement on it. So it's very hard to amend the Constitution. It's, you need the House, you need the Senate, you need, the 3/4 of the states. You need a tremendous amount of support for whatever this change that you want to make is.
Right.
So I think that looking at an amendment as the way to go about effecting change is not really the most logical one, because I don't think that you're going to get,
because the amount of consensus that you would need.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. This is more of like kind of like, if I could wave a magic wand and do something different, this is what I would do. And it's a great thought exercise, but it's not necessarily.
It's a little bit like post hoc without any better wording. But with that being said, do you see it as a possibility of introducing something like the state's First Amendment in another way, or how exactly that would get instituted? Like, would that have to come from federal voting, federal policy getting instituted?
I think you could do some things through policy changes. Honestly, some of the more minor changes, like, for example, I believe one of the points of it was that the president would have to visit each of the 50 states every year.
That's a simple policy vote.
Agreed. Yeah, that could be done through rulemaking. You could say, look, the the funding. Hey, we're going to fund the executive office of the president, and we'll pay for Air Force One. We'll do all this kind of stuff. But here's the requirement: you got to go to all the states. That would be something that I don't think you need a constitutional amendment for that. Now, in terms of changing who actually serves in the House and how that's done, and the election process, yeah, that would all be constitutional, and I don't see that changing.
But it would require an amendment if it were to be done.
Yeah, if you were going to change it as dramatically as that. Now, what you could do, which I think speaks a little bit to what Herb was talking about, is like, if we're going to try to get the money out of politics, like there are changes that could be made to federal elections law in terms of spending, in terms of advertising, and like there's a lot of stuff you could do through just changes in that elections law that wouldn't change the fact that you'd have districts in 435 congressional districts who each vote for a candidate who must be 25 years or older, and all the things that are in the Constitution. But you could use election law to tweak how that process occurs, and
Gotcha.
so there's things that could be done along those lines. I think the last thing you were asking, like about kind of concluding thoughts or whatever, is that both the States First and some of Herb's 1964 plan. Oh, and may I just say, like I said, I actually agree with Herb on a lot of stuff that he said. I mean, I think he made some really good points. He kind of lost me on some of the incarceration stuff and the drug stuff and whatever, but in terms of his thoughts about promoting family values and some of the libertarian things that he talked about,
Absolutely,
I'm on board with a lot of that. Changing and ending welfare, or at least putting it into the hands of the states and things like that. I'm kind of with him on a lot of that stuff. One thing I can't say I totally see eye to eye with him on is like this whole like 1964 notion, and I get why he chose that year, Civil Rights Act and all that kind of stuff. I fail to agree that was like the high point of our American society. However, I mean, the 60s, I mean, to put it rather bluntly, the 60s were a disaster in many respects. I mean, it's a complicated decade. I mean, it's unfortunately, again, one of the things education in schools do. It's like, oh, we're gonna have 60s week and we're all gonna dress in tie-dyes and listen to Jimi Hendrix and peace, love, peace and free love, and make love not war, and like that's everybody's concept of the 60s. I mean, the 60s were rough. I mean, just in our country, I mean, you had Kennedy assassinated in 63. You had Malcolm X assassinated in 65. You had RFK and MLK assassinated in 68. And yes, there was the backdrop of the space race and eventually landing on the moon, and there were these uplifting things, but you also had the Chicago riots, you had race riots, you had Vietnam really getting going by about 65 or so.
Right.
So it was a crazy period in our history, and then and not one that I think that we aspire to get back to.
That makes a lot of sense, though.
If he's talking about the notion of a time when individual and civil rights were more respected, okay, I get it. I think in terms of the stability and peace of society, I think the 50s are probably, the late 50s might have been a little bit closer to that. I know we hadn't passed the Civil Rights Act yet, but I think you had.
But that national feeling that you're going after, and a lot of the nuclear family stuff, 100%.
Yeah, agreed. But I think that one of the key things that both of these the ideas, whether it's the State First Amendment or the 64 plan, the one word that I don't think that either of them really used, but I think is critically important to all this is citizenship. Is like,
Mm,
what does it mean to be a citizen? It's there was at one point in our history, the notion of being a citizen was kind of like above all else. In fact, even into
right.
I remember Reagan, and I think even into the early 90s, you had a common theme of political speeches, but Reagan used this quite a bit about the highest honor I will ever, highest title I will ever hold is the title of American citizen. And the, thanks to Peggy Noonan for that one. But there was a real emphasis on, there's something special about being an American citizen. There's a reason why people from all over the world want to come to America to become
Sure.
not just to live here, not just to work here, but to actually become citizens where they can participate
Mm,
in our government, where they can vote, where they can um, contribute to society. And that citizenship, if there was some discussion of the Roman Empire. Rome also a republic. The notion of being a Roman citizen was an incredibly big
highly
deal.
esteemed, yeah,
Um,
sought after. Right.
uh, I mean, even the biblical stuff, like, there's a reason why all the other uh, disciples and were kind of, brutally killed off, and Paul was given the honor of not being crucified because he didn't crucify a Roman citizen. Paul was a citizen because he had been a centurion, so he was only beheaded. Big big improvement, I
Yeah,
know,
big step up,
um,
yeah.
but like
Symbolically, it was huge, yeah.
the horror of crucifixion was saved for the non-citizens, the real scum of
Right.
the earth. But we don't want to crucify anybody or behead anybody, but the notion of being a citizen in a country has to mean something, and especially in a
Mm.
in a republic, and that
We've
there is a
definitely strayed away from that recently,
yeah
especially when you talk about voting and participating in the government. It's sad that we've eroded that to the point, like I've never heard someone mention citizenship in the way that you're mentioning.
and also it kind of talks about the open borders thing too. It's like,
Sure.
or it's almost like, well, we have all the euphemisms. We have newcomers, we have migrants, we have this and that. Like, okay, well, whatever you want to call them, like there may be people here in this country, and there may be things we have to do, if they have certain needs or whatever. But we have, if we have citizens who
Correct.
really belong to this country, and that our policies need to really focus on taking care of our own citizens,
Couldn't
and
agree more.
that citizenship needs to mean something in both directions. It needs to mean something for the government taking care of citizens over anybody else that happens to be here, but it also means that citizens need to kind of put back into the country by abiding by the laws, having uh, a shared morality around what is right and wrong.
Absolutely. Buying
And
into the moral fabric, buying into the true economy of the United States is another one.
yeah, and we, if you look at like some of the looting and the rioting, I mean, there's no regard for my fellow citizens. There's no
No,
regard for property rights. There's no regard for shared morality. I'm just going to do this because it feels right. And
and everyone else is doing it.
yeah, and I think,
Yeah.
any of the other plans, any of the other proposals, like none of that stuff works until we get to some agreement
Interesting.
of a baseline of this is what is right and this is what is, just. Because if you don't have that baseline moral fiber that comes from a shared morality, then you got nothing.
John, I mean, that is something to take home and think about for sure, because I mean, that's a point to be made, and I wish I had thought of it in the moment, honestly, but it's true. If you can't come to grips or come to compromises or be able to live in a society with people that aren't 100% on your plane, then we don't really have any sort of plan going forward to talk about until that moment is reached. Right? There is no point in installing a plan that is so transformative if half or more than half of the country's not on board.
Yep.
I couldn't agree more, John. I couldn't thank you enough for being on this show. I do have one extra bonus question that
Yes, sir.
I want to get to you, and other than that, I want to let you go free. Like I said, couldn't thank you enough. Everything that you put into this has put a lot into perspective for myself, and I can't imagine that some of the listeners had a lot of questions answered, especially if they've heard those episodes with Jack and with Herb. I know they were pretty well liked, especially Herb's episode. So if you haven't seen those, I'll link those in the description. And other than that, John, if you had nothing else, we'll let the people enjoy the rest of the day.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All these bitches say, damn, I wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.